Hello, happy Friday, and welcome to our weekly environmental news roundup. I'm Dale Willman. I run the Resilience Media Project at the Columbia Climate School. This program is being produced in cooperation with the Society of Environmental Journalism. SEJ sends out a daily email roundup of environmental news. It's free to subscribe, and you can look for it at sej.org. Each week on this program, we talk about what's been happening in environmental media. That's followed by a deeper dive on one or two issues. Today, I'm joined by Raymond Zhong of the New York Times. We'll be talking about his recent article on the coming California megastorm, lessons from its writing, and his role in its online visualization. And I'll have a longer introduction in a few minutes. But first, a short news roundup. And let's get to our screen so we can make that happen. And of course, you hit the wrong button. Hang on a second. There we go. I think everybody's used to this process by now. All right. So, of course, I think this week we have to briefly mention the signing by President Biden of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act and the billions of dollars included that will help to fight climate change. It's not new news, but it's sucked up a lot of oxygen over the last week. It's the largest such measure in the country's history, and there are many entry points in the measure for local reporters to find their own angle for coverage. Heat, meanwhile, it remains a major story across the U.S., and of course, so do the ads. CNN did an interesting take on data that shows just how extreme heat is becoming the norm. And it's a really interesting story. I suggest you take a look at it. You can find the study by the First Street Foundation at their website, firststreet.org. And as you cover heat, or frankly, just about any environmental story, it's always important to talk to communities of color about how the topics affect them. Extreme heat is just one story that has a major effect on these communities, and this story from E&E's Climate Wire explains. I would also suggest that you think of other populations at risk. When it comes to heat, one of the biggest populations, of course, is the elderly. And there's been a lot of research into this, and the results seem to be pretty consistent, and that is those who are elderly who have social networks survive better than those who don't. So if you're in a big city and you're elderly and you don't have anybody to check in on you, anybody to take you in if you don't have air conditioning but they do, then you're more likely to die in these heat waves. So that's always a very interesting take at these stories about extreme heat as well. And of course, we'll be seeing more of them as time goes on. Finally, one more story that is easy to bring to your community. Forgot about this one, the hundreds of thousands dropping flood insurance. So for those of you living in flood-prone areas, this is a really good topic to look into. I've seen plenty of stories about the increasing need for flood insurance, but not much about affordability of that coverage. And that's a really easy story to localize wherever you live. And finally, this one, also from the New York Times, which is an easy one to bring to your community. If you have a college nearby, and many of us do, try to check into their investment portfolios. It's probably not possible if it's a private school, but it can't hurt to ask. But for many state schools, where they invest is likely publicly available. So check around and see what you can find, and see if you can find ways to bring that to your local readership. And that's our environmental news wrap up for the week. Raymond Zhong is a climate reporter with the New York Times. And Raymond, I'm sorry, I meant to ask you how to pronounce your last name, and I'm probably butchering it, so I apologize for that if I am. Raymond was part of the team that won the 2021 Pulitzer Prize, excuse me, in public service for the coverage of the coronavirus pandemic. It's live, so of course I just got a notice that they want to restart my computer, so sorry for the distraction. He joined the Times in 2017 as a technology reporter and was based in Beijing and Taipei, Taiwan, writing about Chinese internet tycoons, semiconductors, trade, agriculture, and the Communist Party's growing toolbox for high-tech censorship, surveillance, and propaganda. He's the author of a recent story by the New York Times called The Coming California Megastorm, which is what I want to talk about today. We had hoped to have one of the tech people who helped with the background presentation or the presentation of this article. They couldn't join us, so we're going to try and do something more of a deep dive tech program in the next few weeks. But in the meantime, we've got Raymond to talk to us, and I thank you for joining us. So with that background, first, I'm curious what you've learned from your previous beats that was transferable to covering climate. How did your career so far inform your current work? Because it's been rather diverse with things that you've covered up until this point.
It's a great question to start with, Dale. Thanks for having me today. I think really what it's about, and this is true for so many different kinds of beats, it's about really it's about sort of bridging a world and community with a language that can be abstruse and technical and sort of closed off to outsiders, and bringing that to life for ordinary readers. And I think I've sort of figured out a knack, I guess I have, for wading through technical jargon and making it accessible. I think it's such an important part of what journalism in many forms can be. So I guess that's sort of the through line I see in my career. I've sort of been gravitating towards subjects that can be very technical and very complicated, and it's sort of the satisfying thing is when you can digest all that and put it in a new way and make people who wouldn't have cared about it really pay attention and stand up and say, this is important and interesting, and we should be thinking about this. And so that goes for flood risk, it goes for technology and computer chips and sort of a lot of the other things I've covered.
But high-tech surveillance and that realm doesn't quite seem to transfer over. But I believe that we're a product of all those things that we get, that we learn in as we go along, and those things, if we're open to it, can help inform what we do now. But that seems like a bit of a stretch.
I don't know. I guess, yeah, it does sort of feel like sort of what politics reporters even are doing, right? They're sort of imbibing a very closed off world and bringing it to the rest of us to make us interested in it. So, it's not directly transferable skills necessarily, but I think that's it's a huge part of journalism's value. It's sort of bridging closed off worlds.
All right, so let's talk about the megastorm. Give us a bit of background, please, if you would, on the story itself and what it's all about.
Sure. It's sort of trying to chronicle the first part of what the state of California is hoping will be a multi-year project to look at a much bigger, much scarier version of a storm that it gets most winters. California gets these winter storms that bring a lot of rain and snow. And most of the time, the storms, they're mild. They, on average, they help replenish the state's water supply. They don't cause catastrophic flooding. But California over the past century and a half has been hit by really strong versions of these storms. And so the state's really trying to get a grip on, okay, what's the strongest, what's the sort of worst case scenario for this kind of storm, and how well would we do in that situation? And so they've commissioned a couple of groups of climate scientists to start studying what that worst case scenario might look like. And so the first part of that exercise is the academic paper that I sort of featured pretty high up in this story, which is an attempt to model in great detail using the most sophisticated modeling and simulation techniques we have, day by day, hour by hour, what this storm could look like. And so that's the first part of what the story does. It sort of walks you through in great detail what the storm could look like. Of course, the storm, when it actually happens, might not look exactly like this. This is just based on a computer model. But it's indicative of a category of storms that California is likely to face. It already is likely to face, and the likelihood is increasing as climate change continues. So that's where the story starts, but then I do attempt to look at what the state is already doing or failing to do to prepare. And I think that's really where you can see, and the state is really hoping to use the academic paper to do more of this. But it's already a threat that California faces today. People are already thinking about what it means to have this threat and what we can do about it now. And so that's the rest of the story really tries to take a hard look at where the state is. And there's some reasons to be concerned. And there's been a lot of progress clearly, but I think as with every human endeavor, it's fallible. There's things that you can't necessarily anticipate, and there's always going to be budget constraints and other real world constraints. So that's the tension here. Even if we know something like this could happen, it's hard today necessarily to do everything we can to prepare.
And perhaps even imagine what is necessary to prepare.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about how the story was treated online, the visualization techniques that we saw a moment ago when I put it up on the screen. Obviously, the tech side in this instance is not your focus. Your focus is on the story itself. And the tech person couldn't join us, but it's not just about how you build it. There's a lot of other considerations that go into this. So first, from the tech side, can you just describe a little bit from what you can in any way about how it was done, how it was represented?
So the paper that I mentioned, the starting point for this story, includes data on 2 hypothetical storms. And the data is very rich, it's detailed, it's high resolution, it's at a 6-hour interval over the course of 30 days, step by step how this storm would play out. So that's a real gift to the graphics wizards at the New York Times who can present that data just really faithfully, straightforwardly. This is what the storm would look like. And when we put it on the screen for the first time, you really do see, wow, okay, this is a simulated storm, but it looks darn scary. It looks realistic. It is realistic. It is based on physics. It is not sort of hypothesized, 100%. It's based on very well-developed techniques for understanding these kinds of storms. So in that sense, we had this data, we had the ability to visualize it, and then it sort of became a question of, it is a 30-day event. We don't necessarily want to make you, the reader, scroll through 30 days of a storm. There was a lot of consideration about, how would we present this in a way that would be engaging? We didn't want to bore, but we didn't want to bore people, but also faithful to the science and accurate and really telling a story as opposed to simply just putting it on the screen. So there were choices about how fast things would move, about what text would accompany which portions of the visualization. It became a very choreographed sort of exercise between the writing and the visualization. And so while I wasn't the one doing the coding, I was pretty involved in imagining and conceiving of what this would look like, because we did really try to integrate it with the text. We didn't want to just sort of make it feel like a video plopped in the middle of the story that you would pause the story to watch. We wanted to make it, really the text and the visuals should enhance each other. And I think we did spend a lot of time just making choices that, like even down to the labels on the visualization. Where would the labels be helpful? Where would they be distracting? And even when we think about, so many of our readers are reading us on phones now. How could you present this on a phone screen in a way that would still be engaging? So you couldn't really stuff the visualization with too much, because then it would be lost in the phone version. There are a ton of choices that sort of are involved in this, and it just is sort of testament to how much we realized the visualization was part of the story. It was just as important as getting every word in the text right.
I think that responsiveness from different platforms is something we forget about at times, but that's a critically important thing, because so many people do access from tablets and from cell phones, and if it doesn't look right, you've lost a lot of people. The editorial part of that, I mean, I'm sure you're right that it's critical to have that sort of dance, the two sides sort of back and forth and together. What sort of alterations, changes did you have to make? What were some of the decisions that were made that affected the way you wrote it, making it a different process than what you might normally have done?
I think even down to, we think, I had written a block of text at the top that could plausibly go, with these visualizations. But then sometimes when we put the text on the screen next to the visualization, the text overwhelmed the visualization. It was sort of 5 lines of text was too much. We wanted to keep it at 3 lines. We wanted to make sure sentences were broken at the right moments to correspond to what was happening in the storm, in the visual component. So it really, it was integrated that closely that I would have, if I had been writing this as a normal story, I would have written 5 lines of text because I thought the sentence needed it. Then the visual people would say, actually, I think 3 lines would help make it punchier here. We need to keep up the rhythm, the tempo. And so, yeah, it is a totally different way of thinking about even writing than I'm used to. And I've worked on visual projects like this before, and so I had some understanding that this is needed. But you do, if you spent your whole career just writing for putting words on a page, it can take a little getting used to.
Kind of a literary dance. I like the imagery of that.
Yeah.
So when you started reporting, whose idea was it to visualize this? Did you at some point say, wow, this is a story that would be enhanced by having a visual treatment, or did the tech guys come to you? What happened?
Once I sort of caught wind of the research and I knew that there was data coming down in the pipeline, I think I immediately thought that this would be worthy of visualization.
Because of the data component elements of it.
Yeah. And I think basically, at the climate team at the New York Times, we've gotten pretty good at sort of, we have some really sharp colleagues who are sort of so attuned to visual possibilities in all of our coverage. Because I think we do see what a difference it makes to reader response, to the ability to, it really heightens our storytelling ability. And so I think we are all sort of constantly looking out for ways to bring that element into our work. And so this one really felt like a natural possibility. And once we sort of decided the story was worth the investment of time and resources, because it is still time consuming to do these kinds of visual projects, then the rest sort of flowed from there.
So, excuse me, it's an editorial process. How involved were your editors in this?
Quite a bit. I think, again, because we have now a couple of years of experience where we're very, I think even more than most other desks at the New York Times, we're very visually oriented. We have really become more ambitious about visual storytelling. It's not a big task to convince editors. I mean, not every story can get this kind of treatment, but once we agreed it was worth it, the question just became, realistically what was possible. Even with data, you can do so many different kinds of things. You can really do something quite simple. You can just have a few charts, or you can really go something full scale like this. So it's just partly a matter of who's around, how much time we have, but the commitment is there, and I think it's not sort of unique anymore to say this story is worth a fuller treatment. It's not unusual anymore.
Is it when I think of the stories that have really made a big splash with this style, Snowfall, there was one from the LA Times, and they were essentially TikToks. They were timelines, and that would seem to lend itself to this kind of presentation. Is that sort of what the thinking is in the world of this sort of design?
Yeah, I think just like in writing, chronological order is a powerful structure to organize things. And so in this case, yes, we had a 30-day storm, and it just felt natural that you would want to see each of those 30 days with a sort of little counter in the corner that says day 1, day 2, day 3. So that structure was immediately appealing to me. I think the alternatives we'd considered were just visualizing a few specific moments during the storm. You would have sort of in days 4 through 6, it looks like this, and this is the interesting feature of those few days. And then you would pull back and say, oh, day 13 through 14 looks like this. But it felt, yeah, I think the chronological structure is a just simple but very effective one. And I'm glad we were able to do all 30 days like that.
A concern, and we've sort of been on the edges of this question to some extent, but the concern editorially, and has been forever, is final control. So I'm assuming that the news side had final control over the presentation and how it affected the story itself, but I want to make sure that's the case.
I think there's not so much. I didn't feel in this case and in past projects that there was much of a tussle over that. I think really within the climate desk, we have 2 reporters and 1 editor who are just graphics reporters. They're not separate from our team. They're not sort of borrowed on secondment from another group. We're not sort of we're not playing tug of war with them. They're part of our team. We work hand in hand with them, and they were the ones who contributed to this. And so it's nice that the Times has decided that's the way to organize a team. You don't want to have those battles over control. Again, because visual storytelling is now part of what we do, so the people should be part of our team.
So in a sense, they're news people just as you are. So
yeah,
they have a
exactly.
sensibility beyond coding or whatever.
Right. And if I were better at my job, I would probably start to learn more coding too. But I have not done that so far, but I'm open to doing it in the future. I think we all, at the Times, many of us have now worked on such projects, and I think now at least I've gained some familiarity with the tools. I'm not necessarily going to be doing this single-handedly next time, but it helps to have some first-hand experience with what it looks like at a nuts and bolts level. And so,
well, it makes the collaboration so much better if you understand their role and what they're trying to do, and they know what it is that is important to you. That connection, that collaboration goes much easier.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, because I have some understanding now, I also know what's possible and what's not possible. I think sort of that can be one issue when your ambition sort of and sort of the constraints of reality collide. I think because I've worked on a few of these projects now, I know better going into something what's actually feasible and what's sort of an insane demand to put on our graphics team.
It's interesting. I for the last couple of days I was searching, trying to find other examples of this kind of work, and trying to find any articles or conversations about the use of this. And I didn't find a lot out there. What I found was talk about graphics, about spreadsheets, about putting numbers in stories and charts and graphs and things. And I was really struck. It seemed almost comical how old school doing that stuff seems to be now. You know, it's just standard. We put in graphs, we put in bar charts, we put in things, and I remember when those first came out, and people were going, "Wow!" because you could suddenly visualize that data. And now, compared to what Megastorm looks like and all these other projects, that just seems old to me in some sense. So it was funny finding all these articles about graphics, and they're still needed. They're still important, and graphics are more than just charts and things. So I acknowledge that as well. But imagery with explaining information on it. But nonetheless, it seems like this is clearly the future of this sort of representation of stories that are data heavy, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think even we have to now be much more discerning about putting too many graphics in. Certain stories, if it doesn't really aid in the storytelling, if you're not, as a reader, really gaining anything new that isn't already in the text, for instance, by seeing the graphic, then we're just not going to put it in. I think there's really a sense in which readers can be fatigued by these things as well. And you have to be a little bit more careful about not giving them more than they actually need to feel the story. And so even for this project, there was a lot of conversation, because there's so much data, there were so many different potential visual elements we could include. And we really wanted to make sure it was just what was needed and not sort of things that readers would just sort of glaze over. It is, not every chart is going to really help tell the story.
And it's interesting. I mean, it's almost cliched at some point. You have these exciting tools, so you start using them because you have them, not because that they're possible. I work in audio a lot, and we call them audio cliches. They're really clever ways to keep people engaged in a story, and someone hears that, then everybody's doing it. How many podcasts have you listened to where you go, oh my God, they just ripped off This American Life? When it becomes cliched, it loses its value. So how do you draw the line? What are some of the considerations, if you can think about this, what are some of the considerations and things that you ask yourself as you're debating whether to use a graphic or just write your text in a fashion that will explain? How's that work?
I think just as with writing, you just really have to put yourself in the mind of a reader who's got a ton of other things they could be reading or watching or listening to at any given moment. And they're scrolling through your story and you have their attention for the precious few minutes. They're on the page, and if they're scrolling by, what do they actually want to be seeing at that moment? What's going to keep them scrolling a little bit further and a little bit further? It's sort of really a very similar philosophy to writing, I think, where every sentence is an opportunity for somebody to stop reading, and you got to give them a reason to keep going. And so if you're looking at some data and saying that, well, this is sort of interesting, why don't we visualize it here? Why don't we put a bar chart here? Well, is someone actually going to have that reaction, or are you having that reaction because you're familiar with the material and you think it's interesting? Is someone else going to find it interesting? You sort of have to be very ruthless sometimes and say, no, that's actually a little extraneous, or that's a little wonky. It's not going to hit someone over the head. You just have to kill your darlings, just as in writing.
It's kind of a cousin to assume knowledge. We assume that everybody understands what that acronym means or whatever because we've been around it so much. And in this case, you're wanting to express with these tools and can overdo it as well.
Yeah.
So what did you have to leave out? What was lost in this process? What information would you really, when you look back, say, man, I wish we could have included that?
I spent a lot of time in California reporting the story on the ground, and I think there is so much more to this just general question about, is California ready for future storms? And I think, I'm sort of, I've done some of these projects, but at heart, I'm still sort of fundamentally a reporter, and I like being out there with a notebook and talking to people. And so there were so many interesting conversations with people who think about these things, whose lives are entwined with these kinds of risks. And I think, I hope there's more stories to come here, because I think this is it's nothing, at one level, it's not new for California to know about these risks and to be living them and experiencing flooding every few years. But there's really good reason to believe the future has a lot more dangerous, more intense storms in store for California. So I really, as long as the story already is, there's so much more here, and I hope that I've heard from people who say this. The story has sparked conversations, which is ultimately what you want to hear, because it's a complicated issue, and it's easy to not think about it most of the time. It's not like drought recently in California where it's in people's faces all the time. It's something that happens relatively infrequently. California has gotten storms every strong storms every decade, every few decades, and so memories fade, and people forget, and so it's important to keep all this, keep all these issues alive at least.
I want to talk about engagement and response of audience, but um, when I was an editor at NPR and someone would pitch a story, I would often say, well, that's not a story. It's three stories. You try and cram so much in, and it loses a lot when you put so much into it. I don't think you did it with a story. It's not what I'm saying, but there's a saying that many people at SCJ like to use, which is that environmental stories don't break, they ooze. It's sort of a slow reveal. And I think what you did with the stories, you took something that is a slow reveal and made it engaging and exciting and interesting and brought people into that story. So when I see that, I always think, man, don't make it a one-off. Follow up, do more on it. This should be something that has more legs and more depth to it. Is that part of the thought process when you do this? And your editors, do they see this need with many of these stories? I'm going to pick on
Uh,
the Times for a minute.
I certainly hope so. With this one, certainly, I think there is more to be done. Yeah, I think one one challenge with this one was, as I said, because it is something that happens not every year. It is something that people have the ability to forget about because it's not constant. This flood risk. We really did have to think hard about what is the thing we can show. Right, we're not going to just write a story about a hypothetical future flood. We want to say why this matters today, and really finding the right recent antecedents to give this a narrative was part of the reporting. And so I think ultimately 2017, which was an incredibly eventful year for California rain and storms, proved to be just full of drama and sort of really, there was so much that happened in 2017 that did make the news, but there were so many stories as well of how people had to deal with those storms that didn't make national or international or even beyond California news. And so, yeah, it was important to have that grounding. So this is something recent. This has really happened to people in the not very distant past. This is why we should care about it now. And I think that there's even this past winter in California was very dramatic. We had a very incredibly wet October that transitioned into one of the driest January through Marches in the state's history. So stuff is ongoing. It's a live issue, and we just have to. I think it's our role here to tie those strands together and make it feel alive for people.
But it's making that link to the present that's so difficult often, especially with things like climate stories, with many environmental stories. It's sort of that future thing. And, economists talk about discounting because it's a future cost. It's the same thing here that we as humans, it's a tendency. It's what we do is we think about the now and immediate and what dangers, what risks affect me now. And if that's in the future, we sort of can dismiss it. But I think this story, and as you've described it too, has walked that line of bringing the present into the future or the future into the present. And do you find that as to be one of the tools that gets listeners sucked in? As storytellers, we have to give them reason to care.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think that you did that with this?
I hope so. I think the strong hope was that to show that yes, the risk that we're starting the story with is one that is could happen this winter, or could happen in 10 winters from now. And so if California hasn't dealt with this, has dealt with storms that are not as strong as this and struggled, what does that imply for its ability to deal with even stronger future storms? So that was sort of the link to the present that we tried to make. And I think 2017 was the most interesting year from that perspective. But there are so many other instances where California has had storms that are not as strong as the ones we're talking about here. And there have been issues, and just because it's such a huge state, it's such a complicated water system. There's so many different components and people and agencies involved. There's inevitably this is nothing. It never works perfectly, And so there's plenty of links to the present. You just have to know how to make them, how to draw them out.
I don't know why it just flashed in my head. What's the old movie? It's Chinatown, Jake. You know, the water, the
Yeah,
infrastructure, all the things involved in this.
right.
Um, I keep forgetting to mention this. This is a presentation for journalists in particular. And if you have questions, put those in the comments on whatever platform that you're using. And those should show up in the back end here, and we can ask those specific questions. So those of you viewing, if you have a specific question, excuse me, please put those in the comments, and hopefully we'll see them and we can get them up and add those to the conversation. So how long did this whole process take? And I know you're going to make almost every journalist out there immensely jealous with the answer to this question. Those who have to do, dailies and 3 stories a day. How much time did you have to work on this?
I probably got started. This is not continuously, but I got started about 3 months ago. So I did other things in between.
Of course.
But I guess maybe the last month was the most intense.
Is it hard to maintain that thread as you're going in and out?
I've learned to juggle plates, many plates in the air at once. I think once we had a sense that this would be such a strong, interesting set of academic research and then set of broader issues on the ground in California. It was sort of, I had a lot of motivation to keep going at this, because I became wrapped up in the subject in a way I hadn't before. This is sort of my first big story on flooding and flood risk in particular. So it was a lot of very exciting learning for me as well.
So let's talk about the response to it. How did readers react to this presentation? Did they talk about it? Did they mention it? And they now track levels of engagement. Did this spark a higher level engagement than a typical story would? Sorry, 2 questions in there.
Yeah. Well, I'm not the person who stands abreast of all the traffic. There's people.
Oh, but I know you were watching.
There are people who watch it, who have a much better basis for comparison. I think the story did get a lot of attention. The numbers do suggest that. I think, what I've heard from people that I spoke to for the story, people in California, water management system engineers, is that this has made their jobs easier because people who didn't care about this are caring about it, or at least talking about it, and that helps them because elected officials have to care about it, and you have that momentum, that interest, because otherwise, what I'd heard a lot from people in California, planners, people at city, sort of not just state level, but sort of very local level people, is that if they talked about flood risks to their constituents, they're like, well, "You're crazy. We're in a drought. Why are you talking about flood? Why would we need $10 million for a better levee when we have a drought?" And so I think what seems to, and not just my story, the sort of academic findings here have been covered pretty widely, and I think that there is now a lot of interest in staying on top of these issues. So hopefully it's a conversation that will continue.
We know about the attention span, though. It's the old saying that politicians don't get elected talking about infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you going to vote for? The guy who says, "I'm going to cut your taxes," excuse me, or the guy who says, "I'm going to build water lines." So it's
Right.
hard to get a conversation around these things. But what you've arguably done with the story is present a case, because I would assume the lack of preparation, a lot of it is the infrastructure needed to be resilient in the face of these storms.
Yeah.
So it seems you've created some sort of momentum, at least for the time being, for people to have that conversation.
I hope so, because in California, a lot of how this kind of infrastructure gets built is by local communities agreeing to raise their own taxes to pay for things. And they're not going to do that they're not going to take money out of their pocketbook unless they really care about this. And so it's easier, I think, it's easier for authorities to raise that kind of money for expanding roads, for, when you have a traffic issue in your community, that's, it's something you feel the pain every day. But with this, it's pain that might be felt every 10 years or not at all while you're living there. But I think what the research is showing is that these storms were much rarer events than they are now, and they are in the future going to be much less rare still. I mean, I think if you think about a 30-year mortgage, a storm that's a 1 in 100-year event still has a pretty high probability of occurring in those 30 years. And then if you think about a storm that's a 1 in 50-year event, that's an even higher probability. So it's not, sometimes the numbers can be misleading. You think something is pretty rare, but when you cumulatively over decades, it becomes a very real risk.
Yeah, I had a question with that, and it popped right out of my head. All right, so let's talk about the tools. What can you tell me, not being on the tech side of it? Was this custom built? Were there off-the-shelf programs they could use to make this happen? Did they have to write all the code? It would seem, because more and more of these stories are happening, that there are some tools that can make it easier, but I really don't know. So what can you share about that?
My understanding, which is imperfect, is that the Times has developed some in-house tools that help with this. And then also, because the Times has now had a couple of years, maybe even a decade of experience doing these kinds of immersive projects, that's sort of built up a library of sort of, you can crib from old projects here and there. If you like the way the photos transition in and out, from this project in 2015, you can sort of borrow the code from that. So it helps to have that institutional experience and knowledge. I do suspect I think a lot of the basic tools that my colleagues use for data analysis and processing are off the shelf. There's the statistical package called R, which is open to anybody, and this is the same tool that a lot of the scientists use. And so there's a lot of entry points now, as you say. I think the Times does have an advantage from having invested heavily in this kind of work. But I was going to say the other side of just the reporting that went into this story is, it's old-fashioned stuff. It's documents, it's interviews, it's finding the right kinds of people. So the splashy top of this story was high tech, but a lot of the rest of the reporting was pretty low tech.
Of course, without the real reporting, you have no story. Yeah. But I would imagine that a story like this also, that there's a requirement here, that a story like this is. So there's a lot of discussion in the scientific community about extractive science. Scientists go into a community, they take the knowledge and they leave. So how do you have local communities, whether it's an indigenous community or otherwise, how do you have them engaged in that scientific process so it's not extractive? And I think that a lot of scientists have looked at journalism for a long time as extractive. You go and you grab stuff from the scientists, you take it, and you do what you will with it. This kind of presentation, I would imagine, would be more of a collaboration in a sense with the scientists, with the people who are doing the work. Is that accurate? Is there more of an engagement through the process with the scientists, or is that not needed?
This case, I think, is slightly unique in that the work was commissioned by the state of California. The aim was specifically to help policymakers in California. So what the scientists were doing was sort of more storytelling in a direct way than is often the case. They were really interested in modeling these storms for the benefit of policymakers and planners, to say, if this kind of storm hits, here's extensive detail on what it would look like. Now, you tell us, you go and take that knowledge and use it to benefit infrastructure, to benefit disaster response plans. And so they were doing storytelling in a way themselves. And so that helped, I think, because their audience was much more like our audience. Sometimes the scientific audience is not our audience. It is other scientists that can be very removed from the real world. So this one was helpful to be aligned in that way, much more than usual.
Could a story like this be possible without that kind of relationship?
I guess. I think ultimately, as science reporters, we have to, it's not always handed to us on a plate, and we sort of do have to go out and do the work and say, here are these findings. How can we make them speak to people and relevant to people? And that happens a lot with other stories. There's plenty of studies out there that do not get written in a way that is amenable to storytelling, but we do find the stories in them, and it can be excruciating sometimes to have to wade through papers that do not know how to tell a story and extract the story from them. But it's ultimately sort of what we have to do with this stuff to make it sing.
Have you heard from the scientists? Have they given feedback as to what they saw?
They were excited to see the visualizations too. They were excited to see, besides the visualization of the storm, we did a little augmented reality presentation where if you use your phone camera and point it in your room, you can see what rainfall of that intensity might look like and how it would feel. And so that was something that's not directly in their paper. Of course, we used data from their findings, but
put on your swimsuit before you use this this application.
Exactly. Yeah. Sometimes when you describe storms, you can use all the most powerful language you want, but if it's another thing to see it. And I think we tried to do that with augmented reality, which is an area, a burgeoning area.
I didn't look at it with it on the phone. Is that in the final product?
It's in the product. Yeah. If you go all the way to the end, you can scan a QR code on the website, and open up Instagram on your phone and take a look.
That is wild. Okay. So what did you learn from this process? Oh, actually, before we go to that, I want to ask this other part of it too, because I'm curious about the relationship, to continue on that last point, with the scientists. I've given a lot of talks to science groups, and they always talk about better relationships with media and how does that happen. And I said, look, don't wait till they're calling you on deadline. Develop relationships. Take a journalist out to lunch, whatever. But have a conversation. Become trusted. Become known. Of course, it's hard to do that and know exactly who you should be having these relationships with. But I think stories are stronger when there's a relationship, a level of trust with the scientists. Did that happen in this case because you were doing this over 3 months? Were they an early part of the process so you could develop that kind of relationship, or did their work come in later? Sorry, it's a lot of questions again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was only in the final stages where there was really sort of the most close collaboration, once the paper was really close to publication. But yeah, I think just as you say, knowing you can ask a stupid question to someone an expert on these subjects. If you were to sort of call someone out of the blue and ask a stupid question, that's a different proposition. But sort of, yeah, developing that comfort to because there's a mutual understanding of what we're doing on both sides. I think that clearly does help. And those relationships, as I've learned from many years in this business, they develop. Sometimes you are on deadline and you do a story quickly and you have to get it done. But that call is potentially the one that sets you up for the more interesting call the next time. Because you've had that one call and maybe it was a little rushed and you weren't in the best form. But at least they have your name. They know who you are. They're comfortable with what you're doing. And so the next time, there's a reason and there's more interesting work to be discussed, you're set up for that. So I think that's why beat reporting is still so important to what we do. You know, you can do the projects, the big projects, a couple times a year, but if you're not on the beat the rest of the time and sort of developing those relationships, you do sort of lose out. And the two kinds of project, the two kinds of work complement each other very much.
And there's the flip side of that is if you develop strong relationships with some scientists, it's easier to just go back to them instead of developing new sources too. So you have to be aware of that issue. But I think the relationship is pretty key. So let's get back to that. What did you take away from this? What did you learn from all this?
I think well, I mean, I think as I said, I hadn't, you know, like a lot of people I think who've read this story since it's been out, you know, they don't even know California is susceptible to this kind of risk. You know, we think about California as facing scarcity of water issues, not
All the news has been about megadrought. Yeah.
excess of water. So I think but it is so important to understand that there's sort of both droughts and floods are sort of two sides of the same phenomenon, and climate change is simultaneously making both of them worse. So I think that's, you know, if nothing else, I hope that's what others have taken away, that there is another terrible side to the risks that California faces. I think I think certainly Californians, some policymakers in California are aware enough, and certainly after Hurricane Katrina, California stepped up its flood game, and hopefully there will be more in the future, because it's so easy to forget about flooding when you're dealing with a drought as California is.
All right, so this is the tougher question. I mean, I always try to find ways that journalists at smaller outlets can access this sort of thing, can do this sort of thing. Is there any advice that you would give to someone who would consider a project like this? What would you tell them that if they don't have a team back home that they can work with to bring something like this together?
I think,
recognizing there may not be a lot that you can offer, but just asking.
Well, I think, as I said, I feel like a lot of the story was still came through old-fashioned means, and sort of taking the time to really read scientific papers, learn how to read scientific papers, how to digest, how to pick up the interesting bits. There are so many fascinating details that you don't get the first time. And it still takes me several reads of a lot of these scientific papers before I feel like I'm ready to take something out of it and maybe think about it in a fresh way, to sort of put a spin on it, to sort of help other people understand it. So it just, so much of my time is still spent just getting up to speed on the science, and it really is worth the investment, because it is easy sometimes to just you really miss stories. You miss full stories if you don't know how to read these papers. And that is where the work is happening in science. That is where the professionals are putting out their, you know, that is the fruit of their work. And if you're not able to sort of keep up, you do miss out. So, I mean, on the graphics side, there are open source tools. There are ways to sort of participate in that side of things as well. And I wish I could speak more to the visualization side of things, but I suspect, yeah, I think that is still very time and labor intensive. It's probably, there are more off-the-shelf options than there used to be, I imagine, but even at the times with our institutional knowledge, it takes a big team.
And that's fine. Since we couldn't have them with us today, I think that I want to pull together a program in the next couple of weeks talking specifically about the visualization, so we can get more deep in the weeds on that then. Last question. Would you do it again, this kind of a story?
Oh, I'd love to. I did a few when I was reporting on China, and even before that when I was in India. It's such a exciting area where it feels like you are pushing the boundaries of what traditional newspaper storytelling can be. And I'm just glad to be in a place that has people who are as excited about it as I am.
Great. I truly appreciate your time that you've spent with us. But we got to wrap it up. So thank you for joining us, and for those who are watching, I want to thank you, of course, Raymond, for the time you've spent. Next week, Andy Revkin will have our program, and if you want to rewatch this program or any other in our series, check out Andy's YouTube page. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you all have a great weekend.
Thanks, Dale.